These are the recorded lectures for Chapter 32 on circulation and the cardiovascular system. We are going to focus on the last two sections, which is the human cardiovascular system and blood, but I will go through a little bit of information. Okay, so I want you to know the difference between the two types of circulatory fluids because of course, humans have blood, and blood is contained within blood vessels. So any animal that has blood also has a closed circulatory system. And that means that you have blood that is contained within blood vessels, and it's pumped into the blood vessels by the heart, and then it drains back into the heart through those blood vessels. So any animal that has blood, again, has a closed circulatory system. But some of the animals have open circulatory systems, some of the more primitive or simple animals. And their fluid is called hemolymph because it's a mixture of blood and tissue fluid. And what happens is that they have a heart and they have vessels, but the vessels open into an empty tissue space. And then that hemolymph will drain back into the heart. But the vessels do not, even though the vessels leave the heart, they don't attach back to the heart. They don't come back to the heart. So the hemolymph is fluid, again, that's a mixture of blood and tissue fluid. And so that's an open circulatory system. A grasshopper has an open circulatory system. It has a primitive heart, and it has vessels that lead away from the heart. And that heart pumps hemolymph, and the vessels empty into an open space, into the tissues. So the blood does not come back to the heart. It does not remain enclosed within vessels. But the earthworm, which is in the phylum Annelida, has a closed circulatory system. And of course, your chordates do. All of the chordates have a closed circulatory system. All right, so in vertebrates, vertebrates that have a closed circulatory system, we call it a cardiovascular system. Cardio stands for heart, and vascular stands for blood vessels. In the vertebrate heart, there is at least one atria that receives blood, and there is at least one ventricle that pumps blood. The blood vessels are called arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. The arteries carry blood away from the heart. They're under the highest pressure, and then they branch into smaller arterioles, which carry blood to the capillaries, which are very, very small. They're the smallest blood vessels. And capillaries function in exchange. They'll exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the alveoli or air sacs of the lungs. And then they'll also exchange materials with the cells in our body tissues. So they'll exchange materials with the tissue fluid or the interstitial fluid. And then they will drain into venules, which are small branches of veins, and the venules will join into veins. The veins will return the blood to the heart. So the veins are actually under the lowest pressure of all of the blood vessels. Here's a picture of an artery. You can see how muscular its walls are. And here's a vein. You can see that has very thin walls, not as many muscles, and it also has valves. And a capillary, the tissue is composed of endothelium, which is just a layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So it's just, capillaries are just formed from a single layer of cells. They are the smallest blood vessels, and they're very, very tiny, and they're microscopic. So now we're going to compare the cardiovascular or circulatory pathways in the chordates. So we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Fish have one circuit, meaning they don't have, in other words, we have two circuits. We have the circuit that takes blood to our lungs to pick up oxygen, and then we have the circuit that takes blood to our body to deliver oxygen. Well, fish just have one circuit. Basically, the blood flows past the gills where it picks up oxygen, and then it goes on to the rest of the body and comes back to the heart in one single circuit. And fish only have two heart chambers. They have one atrium to receive blood and one ventricle to pump blood. Amphibians have two circuits, and all of the animals after, starting with the amphibians, so your amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, all have two circuits, a pulmonary, which takes the blood to the lungs, and then a systemic circuit. And the amphibians have three heart chambers. They have two atria, and then they have a single ventricle. Most reptiles have two circuits and three chambers, but there is a divider or a septum in the middle of the ventricle. But crocodiles and alligators have a septum that completely divides the ventricle. So it's almost like they have four chambers. Birds and mammals all have four heart chambers, two atria and two ventricles. And here you can see a picture of how it works in a fish. You have blood is pumped from the ventricle. It passes by the gills and picks up oxygen, and then it's transported to all the other body systems and tissues, and then comes back to the heart through the atrium. Then with the amphibians, which have only three chambers, what happens is blood in the ventricle is mixed. It is a mixture of oxygen-rich blood that has come from the lungs and the skin and picked up oxygen. And it's also a mixture of oxygen-poor blood that has come back to the heart from the body systems where it has delivered oxygen. So you have the ventricle that pumps blood to the lungs. And so that's the pulmonary circuit where it picks up oxygen. And it comes back to the left side of the heart, oxygen-rich. And then that same ventricle pumps blood to all of the body systems and tissues. And that blood comes back oxygen-poor to the right atrium. And all of that blood mixes in a single ventricle. But then when you get to birds and mammals, you have two ventricles. So there's a separation of oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood. And the reptiles are going to have a septum that either partially divides the ventricle or completely, as in the crocodiles and alligators, the ventricle is completely divided by a septum. Okay, now we're going to move on to the human heart, which is the size of your fist. It is also shaped like a cone. It's between the lungs and behind the breastbone or the sternum. It is a muscular organ. The muscle is cardiac muscle fibers. And the human heart lies within a sac called the pericardium. And here's a picture just of the outside surface of the human heart. You can see the cone shape here. And what you're looking at mostly is the right ventricle, although the left ventricle is much bigger than the right ventricle. But in this image, the left ventricle is behind. It's in the posterior region, so you can't see it. But it's actually a lot more muscular and larger than the right ventricle is. So here we're looking at the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then over here we can see a little bit of the left atrium and the left ventricle. As far as the blood vessels, we have the superior vena cava that empties into the right atrium and the inferior vena cava that also empties into the right atrium. Then we have the aorta, and the aorta is actually leads from the left ventricle. So here's your left ventricle. So behind this tissue is where the aorta and the left ventricle connect. So there's your aorta. And then the right ventricle empties into the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries, which take the blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Now, the valves of the heart are to prevent the backflow of blood. So the AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, are the valves that separate the atria and the ventricles. We have the tricuspid valve that separates the right atrium and ventricle, and the bicuspid or mitral valve that separates the left atrium and ventricle. And then we have semilunar valves, and they're called semilunar because they're shaped like, the little valves are shaped like half moons. The pulmonary semilunar valve separates the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk and arteries. The aortic semilunar valve separates the left ventricle and aorta. Now we can see all of the structures that I would expect for you to know if you were listing the pathway of blood through the heart. So, and I always start with the right atrium. There's no correct place to start, but I always start with the pathway of blood flow with the right atrium. So I'm going to go over this diagram with you and make sure that I include the pathway of blood flow through the heart. And we're going to include all 4 chambers, all 4 valves, and all 4 major blood vessels. So it's 12 structures that you have to know. All right, the right atrium, okay, the blood starts in the right atrium. It begins here. This is where we're going to begin. It passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then it passes through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries. This would be the left pulmonary arteries, and then back here you can see the right pulmonary arteries. So those take the blood to the lungs. The blood picks up oxygen and then comes back to the heart on the left side through the pulmonary veins. So the next structures in our pathway would be the pulmonary veins, then the left atrium, the bicuspid or mitral valve, and then the left ventricle. And you can see in this picture the walls of the left ventricle are much thicker than the walls of the right ventricle because the left ventricle has to pump blood a much greater distance. If you think about it, where the heart is in the chest, the blood has to be pumped to the very top of your head, to the tips of your fingers, the tips of your toes, and every single cell that makes up your body tissues and organs. But the right ventricle only has to pump directly to the left and right where the lungs are. So it doesn't need to be as muscular. In fact, if something happens and the right ventricle fails to work, if it just dies, the left ventricle will compensate for a while because the pumping of the left ventricle actually causes that right ventricle to pump a little bit. So anyway, the blood is coming through the left atrium, past the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. And then what you can't see is behind this pulmonary trunk is where the left ventricle connects with the aorta. And there is a valve in there called the aortic valve, and you just can't see it in the picture. But the blood will go from the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the aorta and then into all the body systems, the body cells, and it will drain back into the heart through the major veins called the vena cava. The superior vena cava will drain the upper body, and the inferior vena cava will drain the lower body. And here is a list of the pathway of blood through the heart. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to type out a list for you in your notes. So I'm just going to insert a new slide. No, I don't like that one. No. Delete. Let me try this again. Insert a new slide, and I just want to pick a blank one. This will be okay. All right, so all I need is just somewhere where I can type. So we want to start with the right atrium, RA. We're going to make a little arrow, and then the valve is the tricuspid valve. Blood is going to go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, or RV. And then from the right ventricle through the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary valve, and then into the pulmonary arteries. It's the pulmonary trunk and then the pulmonary arteries. All right, now the blood is going to the lungs. And from the lungs, it'll come back to the heart, oxygen rich, through through the pulmonary veins, and then go into the left atrium. Okay, now let's change the size of this. And let's move the appendix thing. There we go. That looks a lot better. All right, so left atrium, and the valve that connects the left atrium and the left ventricle is called the bicuspid or mitral valve. And then the blood is going to move into the left ventricle, and then through the aortic valve into the aorta. The aorta is going to take the blood to the systemic circuit, and then it's going to come back to the heart through the vena cava, and then it will empty into the right atrium, and the pathway will continue. See if I can delete this appendix thing. No, I can't, but that's okay. Okay, so now we're going to go back to, from current slide. Okay, so this is your pathway. If you want to stop and write it down, this is the pathway of blood flow, starting with the right atrium and ending with the vena cava.